I know we aren't even close to the deadline, but trade speculation is one of my favorite things to talk about as a hockey fan, and it's definitely one of my favorite things to make videos on as well. And so far early on in the season, there's been a lot of storylines forming that could potentially lead to some big name players being moved this season. So I have a list of players that I want to talk about in today's video, a list of high profile guys I would consider most of, if not all the players we're going to talk about today, star players. And I'm going to go over all of the reasons as to why I think some of these players could potentially be moved at the trade deadline or at any point during the season leading up to it. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started with the first player, defenseman Erik Karlsson of the San Jose Sharks, a guy who has been talked about a ton to start off this season due to his amazing play. He's back playing at an elite level. If the season ended today, he's probably your Norris Trophy winner. Now, prior to this season, there would have been absolutely no trade market for Erik Karlsson whatsoever, just due to his contract that pays him $11.5 million a season through 2027. However, now with Erik Karlsson back playing at an elite level, and also San Jose Sharks GM Mike Grier coming out and saying he's willing to listen to offers on Erik Karlsson, it kind of raises the question, is an Erik Karlsson trade, especially mid-season, actually possible? I honestly think it is possible, just not entirely likely, and it's not because there wouldn't be any teams out there that would want to acquire Erik Karlsson. I'm sure every team in the NHL, especially with the way he's playing now, would want him on their blue line. Again, it's just that massive contract that makes everything so difficult. It would almost have to be like the perfect trade. A team acquiring him would most likely already have to start off with at least a little bit of cap space. They would probably have to send a good bit of salary back the other way to the San Jose Sharks. You'd also have to imagine that the Sharks would have to retain at least a little bit of Erik Karlsson's contract. Obviously, they're not going to retain 50% of an $11.5 million cap hit through 2027, but maybe 15% just to make things a little bit more doable. And then once you have all the salary stuff figured out, would there be a team out there willing to give up future assets for this player along with taking on that $11.5 million cap hit, or whatever it would be if San Jose retained a little bit? Because with the way Karlsson is playing right now, I can't imagine the Sharks would make a deal just to rid themselves of that contract. You'd have to think they'd want at least a draft pick or a prospect or something along the lines of that in return. So it's definitely an interesting conversation to have. I feel like Erik Karlsson's value right now is probably the highest it's been in a very long time, and the highest it may ever be for the remainder of this contract. So if you're the Sharks, a team that's currently in the midst of a rebuild, and they're not towards the end of the rebuild either, they're kind of just getting started, I feel like if you find the right deal, you gotta pull the trigger. And let's be real, I'm sure at this point in his career, Erik Karlsson would much rather be playing on a contending team, and us as hockey fans, I'm sure we'd all much rather be seeing Erik Karlsson play at this elite of a level for however much long he has left on not one of the worst teams in the league. The next player that I want to talk about is Tyler Bertuzzi of the Detroit Red Wings. I actually made a video like this last season. I had Bertuzzi in that video, and I still feel the same way about him now as I did last year. With the way everything has went with Tyler Bertuzzi over the past couple of seasons, I really feel like the most likely outcome is we see the Red Wings trade him, and if there's any time to trade him, it's going to be at or before this year's trade deadline, because Bertuzzi's set to become a UFA at the end of the season. He still doesn't have a contract extension in place, and Tyler Bertuzzi has already been through a couple of rocky contract negotiations with the Red Wings up until this point. I can't imagine Steve Yzerman wants to risk losing this player for nothing, because Tyler Bertuzzi is a great player. I think he's a very valuable asset right now. He's in the prime of his career. His playstyle is pretty unique. He plays the game with a lot of bite. He plays chippy. He can get in there and muck things up, but he's also pretty skilled as well, and he can complement other skilled players, and we've saw that with him exclusively pretty much playing on a line with Dylan Larkin over the past 3 or 4 seasons, and the past 2 seasons with Larkin and Raymond. Now, as a Red Wings fan, of course this is a player that I'd like the team to keep around long term. I just don't think that's the most likely outcome, honestly. With Tyler Bertuzzi being 27 years old now, he's going to be 28 when free agency opens, if he makes it to that point without an extension. If Bertuzzi were to re-up with the Red Wings, you have to imagine he would be asking for like a 7 or 8 year deal at a pretty high cap hit, and given his history of injury and already him being, 28 years old in the summer, is that something Steve Yzerman is going to want to do? Is he going to want to commit that kind of money to a player that I feel like is more of a complementary player and not somebody you build a team around? And again, like I said, he's a player that hasn't had perfect health over the past couple of seasons. Back surgery especially is definitely something that could linger and have a lasting effect on a player later on into their career, into their 30s. So there's just so many moving factors here. I really do feel like the safest bet for the Red Wings to take would be trading Tyler Bertuzzi at the trade deadline, likely for a pretty big haul. And And it also should be mentioned that the Red Wings have no shortage of wingers on the roster right now. They kind of have a logjam there, especially with guys like Jonathan Berggren and Elmer Soderblom making a step. So I am really intrigued to see what happens with Tyler Bertuzzi. As a Wings fan, the one thing I just do not want to see happen is the Red Wings lose him for nothing as a UFA, because that would definitely sting. Moving along to the next player that I want to talk about, Vladimir Tarasenko, sniper for the St. Louis Blues. Remember a year and a half ago, maybe it was now, when Vladimir Tarasenko actually requested a trade out of St. Louis? I feel like that trade request has been forgotten by a lot of people just because Vladimir Tarasenko has remained with the St. Louis Blues up until this point, and he actually wound up leading the team in points last season with 82, but Vladimir Tarasenko has never taken that trade request back. As far as everyone knows, and going off of what's been reported on, Vladimir Tarasenko would still like the St. Louis Blues to fulfill his trade request, and now this season, with Tarasenko being in the final year of his deal and set to become a UFA in the summer, I feel like now's the time where we could really start to hear the Vladimir Tarasenko trade rumors heat up, especially leading up to the deadline if the St. Louis Blues aren't in an amazing position. And he's a player that I think would garner a ton of interest if made available on the trade market. He has 93 points in his last 90 games. One team that's been linked to Tarasenko is the Edmonton Oilers, especially with Evander Kane being out long term. I think they could definitely use that scoring punch on the wing. So the Oilers are definitely a team that could make sense for Tarasenko, especially with Evander Kane's cap hit going on at LTIR. I think they'd be able to make the money work rather easily, and it's not like Tarasenko's contract is outrageous either. His cap at $7.5 million, but if he does end up being traded, I'm sure the Blues would have no problem retaining maybe even up to 50% of that, just due to the fact that it's up at the end of the season anyways. The next player that I want to talk about is Bo Horvat, captain of the Vancouver Canucks. Obviously, the Canucks have gotten off to a rather unfortunate start to the season. They currently sit 30th overall in the league standings, and it definitely seems like the consensus around this team is that something needs to change, something big needs to change, and I don't think it makes sense to fire the coach or fire the general manager because you just did both of those things last year. I feel like at this point, the one thing they may be forced to do is make a big trade, and I'm not saying Bo Horvat is the player that the Canucks should get rid of. I don't really think he's the problem at all. I just feel like he's kind of their most tradable player right now. He's in the final year of his contract, still without an extension. He's playing the best hockey of his career, so you'd have to think his value is at an all-time high. And say if you're the Canucks and you don't want to trade Bo Horvat, you want to get him extended. If he continues this kind of production throughout the remainder of the season, you're probably going to have to give him a contract similar to the one that you gave JT Miller, maybe even more. And if you don't get an extension done with Horvat at any point throughout the season and you don't trade him at the deadline, obviously you run the major risk of losing him for nothing as a UFA, which would just be a massive setback that this team doesn't need. I know that 99% of Canucks fans don't want to see Bo Horvat go, but honestly, what this comes down to, I feel like, is Vancouver made the wrong decision choosing between Bo Horvat and JT Miller. I mean, just look at the way these two players are playing right now. Bo Horvat is giving it his all, playing with a ton of passion, and JT Miller, he's kind of doing the opposite. He's been really lackadaisical this season. He just doesn't seem to care when he doesn't have the puck on his stick. He's been terrible in the defensive zone. JT Miller being a guy who's also expected to be a leader on that team, you'd think he'd want to be setting a much better example than the way he's playing right now, and it's not like you can just go and trade JT Miller, especially with the way he's playing right now. I mean, his massive contract extension doesn't even kick in until next season. I really feel like that JT Miller extension is going to be what ends up making the Vancouver Canucks trade Bo Horvat, or Horvat potentially leaving for nothing as a UFA. And now for the final player we're going to talk about in today's video, Patrick Kane of the Chicago Blackhawks. This one doesn't really need too much explaining. We all know the current position that the Blackhawks are in. Obviously, they haven't been miserable to start off this season, but this is a team that's not expected to compete this year or for the next few seasons at the very minimum. And with Patrick Kane being in the final year of his deal, this whole thing kind of writes itself. Obviously, Patrick Kane at this point in his career doesn't want to be on a rebuilding team. If the Hawks decide to hold on to Kane for the entire season through the trade deadline, I can't see Kane re-signing in Chicago given their directions, so I think the only logical thing here for them to do is obviously trade him. Now, that being said, there is a couple of things that could make a Patrick Kane trade a little difficult. Obviously, the $10.5 million cap hit, even at 50% retained, a team would likely have to send some salary back to Chicago in that deal, and he also has a full no-move clause on his contract, so he can't be traded to a team without giving the Blackhawks the okay. So I would definitely have to be kind of the perfect scenario, but it's one that honestly I really do think is going to happen between now and the deadline. So that is going to wrap up today's video. Those were 6 NHL stars that I feel like could be traded at some point this season. season. If there's anybody that came to your mind that I didn't cover in this video, please be sure to let me know who those players are down below in the comments. And while you're down there, if you could, please be sure to drop a like on the video. That is the best way to show your support. And most importantly, if this was your first time checking out the channel and you want more NHL content just like this, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I'll talk to you all soon.